Okay, so today we're going to be talking...
gotten to the adult.
That's okay. So today we're going to be talking about fictional world map building. So this is something that is important for any fantasy, science fiction, or fiction author in general. The only time it doesn't apply is realistic and historical fiction, because obviously we know where those take place, because guess what? We live on this planet. However, for the places where you don't live, in the fantasy realms that you've created in your head, or science fiction realms that you've created in your head, it's kind of important to have maps, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of interrealmal or interplanetary hopping around. In which case you're going to need maybe even multiple maps. Now the one problem with maps is you want to make sure that they're simple enough that people can look at them and not be confused, but you want to make sure they're detailed enough that people can look at them and not be confused. There's a fine line. You don't want so detailed that they're like, I can't find this one city, but you also don't want it to be so simple that it's just like land, ocean, bonk, capital. And then they're like, but they traveled to like 5 other cities that aren't listed on the map. That's a problem too. So there needs to be somewhere in between. And if you're doing a different planet for each one, since you mentioned doing science fiction for you, you need to make sure that you have it at the beginning of the book, especially if you're traveling to a new planet. That way they can immediately open the book and go, ah, this is where I am. Instead of going, where am I? For like 5 pages.
That happened to me in a couple science fiction books.
That's why maps are so important, but a lot of people just skip maps because of the fact that they're like, oh, it's too hard. And I'm like, no, this is important. So this is why we're going over this today. I'm actually going to teach you a few of my favorite tips for basic but cool drawing things. You can obviously find super cool things and you can find super simple things, but these are somewhere in the middle, so they look super cool, but they're super simple to draw. You can also Google a whole bunch of tutorials. These are just my personal favorites that I think look the best for the simplest amount of effort. That way you don't have to spend 5 hours on it. You could just spend about 10 minutes and it still looks pretty dang good, or at least in my opinion. I've gotten lots of compliments on the maps I've made, so hopefully that means that they're not just lying to me. So, the first thing that we want to do is figure out what it looks like. So, what do I mean when I say figure out what it looks like or figure out the shape? Well, all continents have a different shape, right? One of my favorite pieces of advice is actually from my dungeon master cousin. His name is James. And he actually said that one of the things he does for his maps is he takes different pieces of actual parts of our world map and then overlays them all together. So that way he can just trace out the edge. So let's say he puts like Italy over here and then like traces the little boot shape of Italy. And then he puts like the fjords of Norway over here, and so it looks kind of like that. And you continue on and you kind of like put them all in this amalgamation. It's going to make it actually look like a super unique map, but it's also going to make it look super hyper realistic because it's familiar to us. It doesn't look like some strange blob. We're like, oh, I recognize those shapes. And yet you won't even notice because if you put it in the right configuration, it looks unique but familiar. And you want that familiarity because then when people feel like that's a real place instead of feeling like that's a blob. You want it to feel like a real continent. So that is something that I would recommend. That's fair. That's fair. There are some maps that are very confusing. We're definitely going to get to that. So with figuring out its shape, make sure that you also decide how big you want it to be. If you're going to do an island, you probably want it to be primarily the island, and then make sure you have water surrounding all of it. Whereas if you are doing just part of a continent...
Wait, what if you're drawing a planet that has no water whatsoever?
I would say in that case, then you're going to want it to fill the whole page in order to showcase the fact that there is no water. Because anytime that someone, like, for example, let's do a blob, even though I said not to do that, let's do a blob. The second that you do a blob, everyone assumes that this is all water. So the only problem with that is that then people just assume it's water, and then you're like, it's not water, and then they're like, what? You lied to me. And it's like, I didn't lie to you. You assumed it was water. You lied to yourself. But they aren't going to tolerate that. So as a result of that, I would recommend that if you're going to do something like that, I would say...
Yeah, but there's gonna be lava, so I could like...
Yes, you could absolutely use lava as a thing like that. Or you could also, like I said, make it extend to the edges of the page. So like, let's say the end of the page is up here and down here. Extend it to the end of the page. But then if it's not part of your thing, so let's do big blob again. And then this is the only part that you care about, obviously, because the rest of the planet, they can't possibly travel the whole planet unless they're insane. In which case, then you can just draw little other borders of countries. So then people are like, oh, hey. And then you are like, the Farlands or whatever. And then you're like, the realm of something. And then you're like, the firewall or whatever. And then when you label that, that means even if you never go there, people are fully aware that there is no water there. You're addressing the fact that there's no water. So that is my opinion on waterless planet.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
I'm glad to help. So, and if you never are going to travel there, I would say make sure that you label it, but you don't like give it any detail, really. Like, if you're never going to travel there, there's no point in being like, and here's the 5 main capitals. No, just say the forest reaches of Nirvana or whatever. And then just leave it. And because of the fact that you leave it there, they aren't going to care. However, if you put a random forest there, like the forest of dragons, everyone's going to be like, I want to go there. And then you're never going to go there, and they're going to be sad. So, don't label things if you're not going to go there. That's another part of figuring out your shape. Don't label it if you're not going to go there. All right. Next thing. All right. Funnily enough, this actually really matters when creating climates. Wind! Wind affects like almost everything in our weather system. Therefore, it's going to affect pretty much any climatary conditions within your continent. As a result of that, you need to figure out which direction the wind is coming from and what's it doing. So, for example, blob again, because I don't have the time for anything but blob. Wow, these continents are crazy. All right, so you want to figure out which direction the wind is coming from, because mountains are going to affect it and create what's called rain shadow. That means that it's going to create different effects on different sides of that mountain. So for example, California, right? Super green, super beautiful. However, desert on the other side. Why? Because of rain shadow. That means all the rain is pouring onto one side, and then the mountains are like, you shall not pass, and then the other side to rise a desert, and it's like, help me, and it's the mountains are like, bad. So that's pretty much how it works here. So, for instance, if you have wind coming down from this direction, and then you have mountains, that's not how we're going to draw mountains, but we're going to go with it right now. That is going to change how everything works. Whereas if you had it this way, it's also going to be different. If you had it this way, it's also going to be different. Now let's talk about all the different directions right now. Oh boy, so many arrows. It's so confusing. By the way, you can't have wind coming from all directions. I know it feels like wind comes from all directions, but generally, there's just one. So, that being said, if wind is coming from this direction, because the mountains...
What if the planet is made of wind?
Made of wind. Well, there's no ground then. So that's a problem in the first place.
Yes, it is.
How do they build cities if there's no ground?
I haven't exactly figured
Great. Once you figure that out, come back and we'll talk. Because you need ground in order to survive unless they're all flying. But even then, they can't be flying all the time. I mean, I guess they can. There are certain kinds of birds that literally fly their entire lives and never land. But, yeah. Interesting topic. I'm guessing they're going to have some sort of flying cities of some sort, in which case you are still going to have wind affect it. It's just probably going to actually affect where things are, because it's actually probably going to buffet the islands and things like that. So unfortunately, your map is probably going to be ever shifting and ever changing. However, if you have things that are changing, you could just do, I'm going to draw it down here, even though that's going to be off the video. You could do like one over here, and then say here is the wind pattern that it travels, or whatever. in that case, then people know, oh, so it's going to be somewhere around this area. Because generally wind has a pattern. Like, yes, every once in a while we have hurricanes, but even hurricanes have, like, a pattern. Is weather fully predictable? No, but that doesn't mean that wind doesn't exist. So if it's fully made of wind, I would say almost all of their islands are going to be fully nomadic. And by nomadic, I just mean they're going to be traveling around a lot, and you're probably going to have to write on the map, like, here are all of its different patterns and probably color code it, so that way they can tell which island's going to be where, and that way they can kind of, like, get an idea for how things move. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have to do that, but that's my 2 cents.
Yep.
All right. So if you're doing a regular planet, though, for your other planets that aren't made of wind, then if this wind is coming from this way, that means that it's probably going to have all the rain on this side, whereas this side is going to be your desert. Whereas if it's coming from down here, it's going to block it partially, but not ultimately fully, which means you're going to get this kind of weird half thing right here, and then you're going to have full desert here. So it's going to get really weird. Then you're going to have, oh man, I probably should erase this and make it a little more clear. Okay, there we go. Anyway, all right. Now if you still have these same mountains and your wind shadow is going this direction, the mountains are actually going with the wind, in which case you probably won't have any sort of desert. Congratulations, you have avoided desert. I feel like it's some sort of video game accomplishment. All right. So it'll still probably affect it slightly and probably have like a slight desert, like right about here-ish. And sometimes you can still have desert even without a wind effect, but that's a different story. That's mainly around the equator, in which case it's all hot and deserty anyway. You can't really avoid it no matter how much rain you get. Then if you have these same mountains, and you have it going this way, desert's going to be on this side. This way, desert's still going to be on this side. But again, you're going to have some patches that aren't going to be desert. And finally, once again, it goes with it, so avoidance again. However, with that being said, this is going to only assist in helping you figure out how the climates are going to be created. No one's probably ever going to ask you how your rain shadow or wind works in your universe, but it's fun if you do know. Plus then you can make your map a little bit more realistic. People like realistic maps. People don't like looking at a map and being like, that doesn't make any sense with what I know to be reality. So even if you never tell them wind goes from this way, they'll probably figure it out. Some nerd will look at your map and be like, so see, and be able to figure out where your wind and rain shadow is. So that being said, and no offense to them, I respect it. That's cool. Just probably won't ever do it myself. All right, so third. Here's where magic comes into play. So, we all know that magic can affect the environment because you have things like elemental magic, like we were talking about before we started the video. With elemental magic, that means that theoretically you could change your environment, right? Like sure, you'd probably, if you are a water person, want to live on a planet of mostly water. True. However, what if you live on a planet that isn't mostly water? Well, you're probably going to want to change that. As a result of that, you could have a continent that has a giant mountain range that has rain shadow that makes it so that this is all desert, and the people say, nuh-uh, this gonna be big lake now. So, with that being said, make sure that you don't neglect the fact that you do have magic, so you can't just be like, oh, well, these poor water people are dying of thirst because it's a desert. Nah, they would fix that, man. They would fix it. They'd just be like, screw this. Boom, lake. So, as a result of that, just don't forget that magic can defy some of the regular rules of climate. For instance, in one of my Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, I actually have it so that one of the... my brain isn't working. The way that the poles and everything work are slightly askewed because of something the gods did. And so as a result of that, instead of having it be the further south you go, the hotter it gets, like it is on Earth, it's actually the further south you go, the colder it gets. because of the fact that I changed it due to gods and magic. And so as a result of that, you can absolutely change what are considered regular rules. But that does not necessarily mean that you can defy all the rules. You need to have a few. But that you can defy rules based on magic. Magic is definitely not something that you want to ignore when it comes to that. And if you don't have as much heavy magic that it can like affect the climate and stuff, you can still use that to affect your culture within that climate. Speaking of which, next one we're going to be talking about is culture. Now this is more a world building aspect, but it is going to affect based on how you build your map. So for instance, if you have a desert culture, you're probably going to want to do a lot of research into Egypt and Arabic countries. Why? Because they've learned how to adapt to those conditions, and their culture revolves around it. And a lot of their cultural aspects actually have to do with all of this crazy stuff having to do with the desert. Whereas living in America, again, culture has to do with all of the crazy conditions that we live in. And then even Alaska, the Alaskan indigenous people, oh my gosh, there's so many different things about their culture that we would think are absolutely bonkers, but because of the fact that they live in a super cold climate, it makes perfect sense to them. And if we were to live there, it would make perfect sense to us too, but because we don't, it doesn't make sense. But if we were to live there, it would make sense. There's been a lot of books I've read where I'm like, wow, that sounds wild, but then I like see it in context and I'm like, that actually makes perfect sense. It just flows with the culture and the climate. So, culture is absolutely affected by climate. That being said, it's going to also affect how your people act and how their culture reacts to those actions. So for example, with the nomadic islands, a lot of the people are probably going to have a very, in my opinion, this is my opinion, again, don't have to use anything I suggest. In my opinion, the culture would probably be very much like nomadic tribes from the indigenous peoples of America. Why? Because of the fact that a lot of them actually followed the herds of buffalo, because the herds of buffalo would migrate. Whereas for them, it's their whole island that's migrating, right? And so if their whole island's migrating, their whole life is going to have to change based on the different birds that are there, based on the different things that are going on. And so their culture is going to change based on that climate, right? So it's important to make sure that you don't neglect to create your culture to fit with the country slash place that you're creating. Just because a lot of people tend to be like, oh yes, in this world full of water, we worship water. And I'm like, why? It's everywhere. It'd be like us worshiping flies. They're everywhere. Why? No, there's not a purpose to it.
When you say worship the flies, I just thought Lord of the Flies.
Oh, no. But yes, you are correct. That is a book. Anyway, with that being said though, it is going to affect culture. And maybe they revere water, maybe they respect water, maybe they have water gods and goddesses, but they probably aren't going to be like, oh, holy water, how dare I touch thee? And it's like, there's water everywhere, man. You're going to be constantly touching water. That's going to be a problem if you're going to do that with your culture. So it's important to take into account that your culture is going to look different based on where they're living and how they live. And especially if you're doing different planets, that's going to be drastically different cultures. So, that being said, we're moving on to drawing. This is probably going to be the longest portion. Alright, how to draw. And I'm specifically talking about map stuff because when it comes to people, I can't draw people. I can only draw chubby cats. Anyway.
Land full of chubby cats.
Exactly. I'm like, if you want a land of chubby cats, I can do that. But if you don't want that, then, well, I can't help you. However, I can help you with these little map things because they are some things that I have learned as a dungeon master and as a writer that make, like I said, a high quality but easy to do map. You could probably make it even higher quality and do like fancy shading and whatnot. But if you just want to do a 10-minute map that still looks high quality, this is what I would recommend. You don't have to go insane by making sure that every little detail goes into your map, unless you want to hire someone else to do that. I wouldn't recommend going insane. So, that being said, here are the basic things that you can draw for your map. So, mountains. Now, for me, with mountains, this is the best tutorial that I've found. I can't name the tutorial because I just found a picture on Google Images and went, that one! and then tried to mimic it. So unfortunately, whoever it is out there, good job. But I can't quote you because I don't know who you are. So you're gonna want to draw kind of like you're doing a crazy crack in the ground.
It actually looks like a face at this angle.
Anyway, so basically, you're also going to want to decide where, obviously, if you're doing a continent and not floating islands in the sky, you're going to want to make sure you know where all of these different cracks hit and how they are going to be. You don't necessarily have to know all the details like we do about Earth, where it's like, this is a sliding plane, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But you do have to at least know what direction you're going with the crack in the Earth. So, that being said, you then are going to take every peak. You're going to
I thought you were making a weep whoop sound for a second.
Now again, is this the best way to draw mountains I've ever seen? No. Is it better than going yes. Hence why I said it's somewhere in between. So this makes it so that it looks slightly more like an actual realistic mountain range. If you want, you can even do like, these are snow-capped mountains. But you don't have to. Although, if you want to, feel free. This, I find, is a good way to get somewhere, like I said, in between the two. So you're not going crazy shading, but you're also not going mountain. Because mountains don't look like that.
Some book maps are so confusing because they do that.
Yep.
And then there's the tallest spike is actually just a small hill.
Yes. And it's like, no, that's not helpful.
Do we actually need to make maps for our story?
Yes and no. If your map is taking place in a different fictional universe, depends. So for example, if you've read Keeper of the Lost Cities, she doesn't have a map. Why? Because of the fact that she goes back and forth between Earth and the Elf Realm all the time, and even in the Elf Realm, she doesn't like make giant journeys across the land, right?
No.
She generally just goes like, here's so-and-so's house, here's so-and-so's house, we're going to this other kingdom. Like, it's enough that you don't really have to worry about it. Whereas if you're like the Lord of the Rings and you're going from here to here, it's important that you know where the heck they're going. So yes and no. If your characters are making any sort of huge long trek across a place, and by long trek I mean longer than 2 to 3 days, then yes, it is important you have a map. Also, it is important if, like him, because he mentioned doing a science fiction one, if you're changing realms or changing places that you're going to be, that you have a map, because then people aren't constantly like, we're in that water world, right? And you're like, nope. And then you're just like, what? Whereas if you have a map at the beginning and you're like, it's not a water world, they're like, oh, cool,
Okay,
moving
how
on.
do you kind of integrate that into your story?
You literally just put it at the very front. And just leave it there, and people can stare at it and reference back at it.
So, like, just put it in the front of the book.
Yeah.
Like, would you just, like, put the map there, or would you put the character's trek on the map?
You can put your character's track on the map. Absolutely. You can, if you'd like, you can put the character's track on the map. You don't have to, but I would say put the map for sure. And if you want to put the character's track, then just do like little beep, 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 and then like label on the side, character's track. Beep, 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 beep. And then that way people know, oh, the dots are so-and-so moving across the continent. So you can do either. However, I will say, like I said, if you're doing a big, huge, long trek, I would recommend having a map just because that way people aren't confused. Now, some people are totally fine with not having a map and are just like, let's dive in, and they're like, I don't know where we are. That's okay. Most people aren't. Yes, so it does depend on the person. However, I would recommend doing a fantasy map if you have any sort of fantasy world that you're going to stay in consistently, that doesn't involve Earth and isn't simplistic. Like I said, Keeper of the Lost Cities is a good example of being pretty simplistic, right? For the most part, she goes to school, she goes back home, she goes to school, she goes back home.
She gets kidnapped.
She gets kidnapped.
She goes to school. She gets kidnapped. She breaks her skull.
So, yeah, exactly. Those are all things that like take place in a general area. So you don't really have to do much. Whereas, like I said, if you're doing Lord of the Rings style, they're traveling the entire book. That's going to be a big, long, lot of map changes. In which case you'll need the map. So like I said, typically I would say put it at the front cover of your, just after the front cover of your book.
I know what you're talking
And then just label it. Okay, cool.
Brandon
about. I will
Sanderson
be
and
right back.
Yeah, no worries.
in one of his special edition Skyward books, he put like all the ships, like their
Mhm.
designs of all the ships in the exact middle of the book.
Oh gosh. You can do that, I guess. Now we're going to talk about
That-
water. Now, this is my own personal thing with water. You can absolutely do the classic meat,
No. I
if you
refuse.
want, but yeah, that's your choice. For me personally, I actually do something far more simplistic, but that's just because of the sake of time, and I actually think it looks better. And I just go boop, boop, boop. And I do that.
looks much better.
I was gonna say, yeah, right? It looks much better. It doesn't feel so intense. Like there's constant stormy waves. So if you're doing like,
I'm sure I might do the intense wave on a lake, in the middle of a lake, in the middle of an island, in the middle of a lake. That's always different.
exactly, if it's like always storming, then that's different for sure. But yeah, so this is how I would do like a lake, for instance. Voila. Again, these are not the best pictures in the universe, but it'll get your map finished. And right now, that's what you need to worry about. Especially because if you're getting traditionally published, then you can be like, here's my map, and they're like, that's okay. Now let's hire a professional artist to translate your map into beauty. So it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to look okay. All right. That being said, next is trees. Beautiful trees. We love trees, right? Trees are great.
Is there a Wi-Fi password?
Nope, there is not a Wi-Fi password. You just hit the American Folk Library thing, and then it will ask you, do you promise to not do crazy stuff? And you say yes, and then it lets you in.
Oh.
I was like, it should do a thing. Yep, sign into the library network. Do that thing. It's the page that says don't do anything sketchy, and you say yes. That is the page. So, alright, so trees. Again, this is probably someone else's credit, but I can't credit anyone because I found these on Google Images. So, however big or small you want your forest to be, I don't know why, but I like forests shaped like that because I find the blob forests are boring. So I prefer to make them kind of semi-swirling and curving because I find the forests that are just a big sheep blob look weird. They look like a sheep when you just go. So that's why I don't do round forests, but that's just me. So now what you're going to do is you're going to start from this angle, doing varied little tree trunks. Now this takes a little bit more time than the others. However, it does look really cool when you are finished. Boop, 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 boop. Trees.
That actually does look really cool.
Thank you.
Something at one point
And then
that's
if you want, you can go
entirely
like boop 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 boop. If you want to be extra sure that they know their trees. And then for me personally, I've never quite figured out how to do rainforest because all the tutorials for rainforest are like insane. Apparently there's no simple way to do rainforest. And so for me personally, I do white for not rainforest trees, and then for rainforest trees I just go. It is now shaded. If it was pencil, it would look better. I just shaded in with pencil, and then the gray trees are tropical and the white trees are basic. That is how I do my trees as far as tropical goes. I wish I had some sort of cool thing that was like, here's how to do a tropical rainforest. But let me tell you, every time I've looked it up, I'm just like, why does this take 5 hours? So
5 hours to draw one tree with a monkey.
exactly. I'm like, why does the rainforest take forever? So generally I just color code it and I do more grayed out forests for tropical and then I do regular for regular. Then people generally have an idea and then what you do is you just have a little key to the side of your map and you just basically say boop 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 equals tropical. So, speaking of that, we'll talk about a map key when we're finished going through all this stuff. Alright, sand. Now, this actually took me a while to figure out how to do sand, which sounds weird because you're just like, man, it's just a random. No. So, the reason that looks bad is A, because of the fact that when you hit it too hard, it makes little smears, like you probably noticed. Those no longer look like dots the longer you smear it. So, there's that problem when you're drawing sand on your map. However, I know, it's slightly more normal. Anyway, so that being said, with sand, I find that it also looks weird if you actually do too much sand, which sounds bizarre, because when you're doing a desert, you're like, it's all sand, so why not? I don't know what it is, but it looks like the universe exploded when you try to do just sand. I don't know why, that's just me, it hurts my eyeballs. So generally, for sand, I'll just do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. I recommend doing uneven amounts because generally when you do even amounts for some reason it looks weird, although you can do even amounts like I just did. And then you just continue doing it. And then if you were to cover a whole map in this and then do like a little cactus. Terrible cactus. Anyway. It's video game cactus, yes. And then you can put little lines on your cactus if you want, your little cactus flower if you want. But generally, the dots are the most important part because it gets across the idea that it is desert. Or if it's not desert and it's a beautiful beach, you can obviously do like seashells if you want to be fancy. So, alright. Now, we already talked about this, but I'm going to recover it because I'm going to do lakes and rivers. Now, this is one of those things where, yes, theoretically you can put a lake and a river wherever the heck you want. However, I'm going to put a stipulation here. If you do put a random lake in the middle of a bunch of mountains and there's no river flowing into it, everyone's going to be real heckin' confused. What? Snow is perfectly acceptable, but even snow would create a river when it melts. So, still would melt down the mountains, so you'd have to show the rivers. So, I understand what you're saying, but there would still be rivers flowing down from the mountains because of the fact that it has to flow down into the pit. Because that's how water works. So I like your idea, for sure, but you'd still have to have mini rivers. So basically what I do for that one is, restart. This is gonna be awful, but just bear with me. Yeah, it's very squeaky. Alright, so basically we have our nice little cluster of mountains. Not the best that I've ever drawn, but I also took 3 seconds. And then if you have a little lake in the center. Boop, boop. Boop, boop.
That is not
Boop,
legal.
boop. Yeah, well, it's a bunch of mountains. It's a lake. Anyway, if you have lake in the center, then you still are going to want to have like little tributaries leading to it because of the fact that it cannot just form out of thin air. That's my point. Is that yes, you can theoretically have a lake in the middle of mountains that has no tributary leading out, theoretically. You can just have it, tiny little tributaries going down from the mountains, absolutely. But you still need those tributaries because otherwise the lake technically exists with no water source. Whereas the snow will melt down the mountain eventually and create a lake. So yes, you are correct, absolutely. Snow melt can do that, but snow melt still creates a river which then creates a lake.
What about a
Yes.
pond on top of a mountain that somehow stayed on top of the mountain and doesn't have anything flowing away from it?
Define on top of a mountain.
On the very tips, all the snow just builds up on top of it when it's
Yeah, this is why I said rule number 3 was that magic can defy any of these rules. So if you're like, I want to have a freaking lake in the middle of nowhere, you can just be like, every year the water goddesses go, whoa, lake! So you can do that and just be like, magic, screw it, I don't care. But, yes, so these are all rules for if you're trying to have a logical fictional map, but keep that in mind. These are fictional maps, therefore you can always just go, magic, guess what? And then it just works. So, by all means, you can absolutely have a lake on the tip of your mountain, I guess, but you do have to explain it with magic. if you can't explain
on the tip of the mountain because of magic.
exactly. See, you got to do stuff like you got to either explain it with magic or logic. That is how I will explain the map. The map needs to be magic, logic, or it needs to be all logic, all magic, or logic and magic. And you got to explain which is which.
Logic and magic.
Logic and magic.
It's magic logic.
Roasted. Ha 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 ha.
I will say that you can obviously do different sizes of rivers and things like that. That being said, that's just very basic. You can always do big river, you can always do small river. It's not too hard as far as that goes. Unless you're going with like the Mississippi River, in which case you can just do like river. But anyway, but that's a different story altogether. Some rivers are evil and giant. Well, not necessarily evil, just well, I mean,
evil
yeah, kind
river.
of. You could do a river of black lava or something if you want.
Or the river
I
comes
will
alive,
say-
it's evil.
I will say that you have to explain where the water comes from, though. I've actually had some times where I've started a D&D campaign, put out my map, and people are like, "Where does this water come from?" Bam! This river, and I'm like, "Never thought about that." All right. So people will actually ask you where your water comes from on your map, and if you can't have an explanation, they will be sad. Luckily for me, I was able to say, "Well, it flows down from the mountains," and they're like, "Oh, that makes sense," and I'm like, "Haha." Or I'm able to say like there's a magical spring, or I'm able to say like the goddess wanted it to be there. As long as you have an explanation, people generally are okay, but people still look at it and go, "My logic meter is going off,
Well,
panic."
You see this woman died,
So
and then her corpse became a lake.
there you go. See, there you go. As long as you have an explanation for it, people generally don't mind too much. Yeah, well, we have the teen tech room next to us. That's the room that we usually use for D&D. So someone's probably going insane in there. So that being said, with your lakes and rivers, if you can explain it by magic or logic, you're okay. Just make sure that you have an explanation for why it is there, because otherwise people will ask you, "Why river?" Because it's happened to me.
Because there is.
All right. Next, we're gonna go over towns and cities. So, if you're doing a typical town, I typically have a key off to the side that says like, one house equals 50 people, or whatever. So then they can even figure out about the same population. So you might want to do an about sign, about 50 people. And then in that case, if you're like, this is a really highly populated town, you can go boop, 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 boop,
That's 200,
boop,
250,
boop,
300,
boop,
350,
boop,
400.
boop. Then you're like, that's a big town. Whereas if you're like, this one, boop, you know that's a small town. So it helps. It helps make it a little bit more simple for the people to understand. So that way, if you're like having them go on a journey and they're like, "Oh yes, we just came from this great big city and now we're in this tiny rink-a-dink town," they're like, "Oh, so this is probably where they are because there's one tiny little home there." Now, this is for towns. Now, with cities, obviously you can do medieval cities, in which case I would highly recommend still using little hut type structure because that helps indication of medieval. But if you're going with like cool science fiction giant Empire State Building like towers. There we go. I don't know why that was really hard to come up with. My brain, I was like, Empire State Building, that was not going for me. Alright, then you're probably going to want to go boop, 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 boop. And you're going to want to do the same thing, where you do like, this equals about 60 people or whatever. And then people can do math based on how many little thingies that you have here. Or you can just be like, bop, city of 60 people.
That's a huge city. Wow. It's a mountain though.
Burp, burp. And then you can do all sorts of things as far as fitting as many as you want to in here. It looks kind of crazy after a while, but they get the gist generally. And of course, you can always do fancy things if you want to do a fancy town or city and you're like, this is the city where they worship some sort of fancy goddess, and you can do like awesome little temple thing with epic little that's not very little gem on the top with an epic giant gem on the top or whatever. You can obviously change it up. However, if you're doing basic towns and cities, that is what I would recommend. Yes, question.
Would that also count for castles?
Yes, if you want to draw a castle, you absolutely can. I would definitely recommend changing it though if there's going to be a castle. So if it's just a regular city, you can absolutely do little huts and towns.
What
But
about kingdom?
if you're doing a kingdom, I would say probably do something like, boop, boop.
See, outline the kingdom, draw the castle, and then all the little towns and cities.
Yep,
that are
pretty
surrounding the
much.
castle within the kingdom.
Yep. So you have like castle, and then you have boop, 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 boop.
And also, if
Yes.
you aren't able to get a publisher, could the cover artists technically do the map also?
Cover artists could definitely do the map. Also, you'd have to ask them in advance if they'd be willing to, though, because some people don't do maps.
Yeah, I don't think I
So-
can do that map. Not a nap. I want a nap.
I want a nap, but I can't do a nap. No, I know what you mean. Map. Yes. You're all good. It happens to me all the time. So that being said, with that, yes, if you are doing independently published route, I would say that you can definitely do that. But that is why in some ways I'm teaching you how to do this, because if you do independently publish, this would make a decent map. Sure, it won't make a gorgeous map, but it will make a decent map. People will look at it and go, nah, not too shabby. They won't go, oh my gosh, Pet's map. But they'll definitely won't be like, that's a map. So they won't be like terrible, but they won't do the other thing either. That's part of the reason I'm telling you how to draw these things in basics, because of the fact that I know it's very hard to find someone who's willing to do a map for various reasons. Like I said, some cover artists don't do maps, other people specialize in maps, and then that's a different cost. So I actually did my husband's map when he did independently publishing, because I knew how to do all these basic map things. Again, it's not the best map in the universe, but it looks okay. I wish it was checked in right now. I could be like, look, pretty. It's not the best thing I've ever done, but that's also because I don't professionally do maps. So yes, that is my recommendation, is to either do something like this, where you basically do your own map and then send it to your person, or just pay for someone to do it. Yeah. And even if you pay for someone to do it, I would say make your own map so that way you can hand it to them and tell them what it looks like, and then they can just make it fancy.
Or you can just hover them and be like, no, it goes right here. Right here.
Yeah, they'd probably be like, I quit after the first 10 minutes. So I would say at least draw your basic map. Even if you're just like, mountain, go here, they would probably appreciate it, because then they can create kind of an idea based on what you have.
How to draw
All right.
a hobbit hole.
Hobbit hole? Oh man, I've never drawn a hobbit hole. Nope.
Just search up green, see,
Anyway,
see
all
the
right.
Minecraft thing he did, and then make it not blocky. It is easy.
Alright. Now we're going to do your classic waterfalls. Obviously. So you have some sort of high height, or unless like in Dungeons and Dragons, I actually had someone who opened a dimensional door into the ocean. Anyway. And so as a result of that, there's now waterfall dripping from the sky. And so I just have waterfall with no point of origin, because it's a freaking dimensional door. Anyway, that person was both my favorite player and also like, I don't know what to do with you. So there's the beautiful dimensional door waterfall if you want to go that direction. However, most of you probably are going to have a normal waterfall that doesn't fall out of the sky for no reason. That being said, you're probably going to have a big slab of rock, water. Again, these are not perfect, but this will get you basic until you hire someone to do the thing. And then on the other side, you can add some extra rocks if you want to. You can add some moss if you want to be extra fancy. But if you don't want to be extra fancy, that's fine too. As long as you get most of the job done, the illustrator will be like, okay, let's clean this up. Because they know how to do the things. That's why we hire them. Alright, the last two are something that probably no one will use, but guess what? I'm going to do them anyway because I like them. And you might use them. If you're doing an Arctic town, fjords are a thing. So, what is a fjord? Fjord is basically common in most slightly more northern towns, such as Norway. Now, hence why it sounds like a Norwegian word. So that being said, with fjords is basically when all the ice was like, I am here, and so the earth was like, I'll try to work around you, I guess, and then all the ice melted away, and now the earth is like still all wonky and shaped around it. So typically it kind of looks almost a little bit like you have a bunch of random little fingers sticking out because of the fact that the ice was all here and now it's not anymore. And the earth didn't know how to fix itself. So it stays like that. So typically that is your basic fjord. Now you also have what's called a delta. Now delta is more common in swamp-like areas, particularly in more kind of like African countries. However, there can be deltas definitely in the United States. They're just in more swamp-like areas. And since we don't have a whole ton of swamp-like areas, we don't have a ton of them. That being said, typically it's when you take a big swamp-like section where it has big chunks of like random swampy kind of island things, and then it continues into an outlet into the ocean. But because it's so swampy, it doesn't quite just fix itself. So as a result, you get all these little chunks of algae and gunk and seaweed that make it so it looks like a bunch of tiny little islands, but what is it really? It's just algae and seaweed and gunk. And then it slowly kind of like dissipates as it goes further and further out into the ocean and gets cleaner and cleaner and less goopy and swampy. So that's your basic delta. All right. Are you going to use those? Probably not. Do you find them fascinating now? I hope so. I like them. I like deltas and fjords. They're some of my favorite things that I ever learned about in any sort of map making class, which I took only one of, which was technically geography. But he was like, make your own map because it'll help you learn about these stuff. Anyway, all right.
It's pretty icy.
This doesn't have a tip. There we go. All right. Now we've come to the ever important conclusion of a map. Name it. Name the cities, name the mountains, name the this, name the that. Now, that being said, name the world. That being said, you don't have to actually name everything. If there's a town that they never travel to, but you decide to put it over here because you know all the lore about it, but they'll never go there, so it doesn't matter, leave it alone.
Town is named Bomb.
You can leave that alone. However, if they go to that town and they learn everything about it, and there they secretly find the magical treasure, it needs a name. You need it to be named. It's no different than characters. If a character pops up and goes, hi, here's your homework, you forgot it, and they never have any other value, they don't need a name. However, if they're secretly the love interest and they're like, you forgot your homework, and you're like, oh, then they need a name. They need a freaking name, okay? You can't just have the love interest be random dude number 4. That's a problem.
Unless if their name is actually
Random dude number 4, in which case there are bigger problems. I have to talk to their parents. Child abuse? Alright, so to be fair though, that actually was a thing in Latin and Roman countries where they'd be like, you know, Quentin, that name, where everyone's like, Quentin, it's a cool name. Quentin, when you go to the Latin root, Quintus, which is what they named their kids, literally means child number 5. So, don't tell anyone named Quentin that, but they're technically named child number 5, irregardless of whether they are a child number 5 or not. So, yeah, that literally, yeah, the Romans did actually get that lazy and did actually name their kids after numbers. Yes, they did. So, that being said, you have to name the dang place like a child, except you should probably name it something that isn't Rover or Freddy. Yes.
Jerry. Could you technically name a town by an actual name, and there's a specific reason why it's named after a human name?
Yes, if it is named after a human name, then you just have to make sure it is explainable. Again, all of these rules are technically, as long as you can explain it by magic or logic, you're okay to define that rule.
The lake, and then Sally died in the lake.
And so now it's Lake Sally. Yep, there you go. There you go. But yeah, so here are some rules for names though.
Oh man.
And again, you can decide to, I can spell. You can decide to go against these if you wish, but just be warned. So, first of all, it has to be pronounceable. Why? Because if someone looks at your name and goes, what? They're just gonna get
Named after
stressed.
the Hawaiian skatefish.
It's
Oh
the
gosh.
Gibraltar.
They're just gonna get stressed. Okay, not only is it gonna stress out your reader, but then it's gonna stress out your reader even more because then they're gonna go to share it with their friend and they're gonna be like, yeah, remember that town they go to? Ekabagi? And they're like, is it Ekabaga? And then they're gonna have a whole argument. Bad juju. Don't do that. If you want to name it something unpronounceable, just make sure that it's this much pronounceable, at least. It has to not be completely consonants, okay? Yes.
Can you technically make it as random as you want, as long as you like below the map, just have the proper pronunciation?
Pretty much all.
Yes and no. It's debatable on pronunciation guides. So first of all, rules with pronunciation guides. There actually are rules for pronunciation guides. I can't go over them all because there's too many. So in my recommendation, if you're not going to look up the actual professional pronunciation guides and how to do it, do not do it. Just make it pronounceable. Why? Because if you do a pronunciation guide wrong, then everyone's just going to be pronouncing it wrong, and you're going to say, no, it's obviously this, and they're going to say, well, you've never looked at a pronunciation guide in your life because according to the pronunciation guide, that's wrong. So there are actually rules for pronunciation guides, believe it or not. It's insane, it's stressful, I know. That's why I'm saying probably just avoid it.
The Gwendolyn Williams pronunciation guide. Read it.
Unfortunately, no one will know what you're talking about.
Oh.
People generally use the standard US pronunciation guide, unless they're from another country, in which case that's on them and they
And make it
need to
German.
figure that out.
Yes.
For German pronunciation guide. Oh gosh. Anyway, the other thing I will say
Oh
is
my
even if you
goodness,
do look it up,
reads.
for example, my husband did a pronunciation guide because he has a lot of Cyrillic-based languages.
Unpronounceable words.
Yes, so he uses a lot of Cyrillic-based languages, and what a Cyrillic-based language is basically things like Russian, where they have silent K's in the middle of it for no reason, which looks
like
cool. However, that doesn't mean it's easily pronounceable by a regular English person. That being said, if you have a pronunciation guide, it is incredibly helpful. It is super great, especially if you're doing made-up names. I highly recommend doing a pronunciation guide. Just make sure, A, you do it right, and B, that you're okay with the fact that you have officially become an epic fantasy author. Congratulations. Because most people who aren't epic fantasy authors don't do that. The reason why is because they realize that it is so much easier to get your book picked up if you don't have to worry about that. That being said, you also have to worry about making one on your own because then you basically would have to, or you'd have to go into your traditional publisher and you'd have to sit there for 4 hours while they say, how do you pronounce this? And then you'd pronounce it, and then they'd write down the pronunciation guide, and then they'd go, how do you pronounce this? And then you'd be there for 3 hours. So your options are make your own, actually follow the rules, and don't just make up crap. Or be there for 3 hours with your traditional publishing company. Or, third option, just make it pronounceable in the first place. So, I will say it's tricky. I love my husband, he is fantastic, and I think his pronunciation guide is fantastic, but it definitely has made a lot of people go, what? As far as how to pronounce things. So I will say, if you want to do a pronunciation guide, go for it, absolutely. Just make sure that you do your research on what sounds do what. Probably look up a YouTube video that says like English pronunciation guide basics, and then be like, what does this weird accent thing mean, and blah, yes.
I made up my own pronunciation guide.
Yeah, you're gonna have to fix it. I'm gonna say that right now. The reason why is because of the fact that if you make up your own pronunciation guide, unfortunately, since it doesn't follow any of the basic pronunciation rules, no one is actually gonna know how to pronounce it because it's in your head rather than in the rules of the universe.
I'm gonna go back and watch the video and see
Just because they
how many
understand
times
doesn't mean
the
it's
word
correct, and especially if you get a traditional publisher, they're going to flip.
and all of that.
So-
in this video, and it's gonna be in the upper 10s or 20s.
But yeah, no, theoretically. So I see what you're saying. I know it's a huge problem, unfortunately. I would say if you're traditionally publishing, they are going to want to do it correctly. Why? Because they don't want to look like idiots. Because technically it's your own opinion. And even though that's great for you, and other people might be able to understand it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, when it comes to editors and whatnot, we kind of have to be snobs in that regard because we're trying to make you look the absolute best that you possibly can. And in order to make you look the best, we have to do it according to laws of society instead of rules of your awesome creativity. So, unfortunately, society has once again gotten in the way of being awesome. But I will say it's awesome. If you want to do your own pronunciation guide, absolutely. I would just recommend if you're going to traditionally publish, looking up how to do it professionally actually. Just because then you can actually know and have people pronounce it correctly, because most people are kind of nerds about that, and they do actually get kind of weird about it if you do it incorrectly. I actually had a girl who did a independently published novel with her own pronunciation guide that she made up instead of using actual pronunciation guides, and lots of people have given her crap for it, unfortunately. So
be nice.
people aren't nice, unfortunately, and that's why you gotta follow the societal rules.
Be nice, Jeffrey.
I know, it makes me sad. So, but
What if
that's the
there's,
thing.
like, a nice day?
Editors
It's
are
mad
doing it.
nice.
Editors,
Mad nice.
editors aren't doing it to be mean. I'm not saying this to be mean. I'm doing it because I want to protect you guys from all the other mean people. I'm doing it because I care. I know. Why is the world mean? I don't know. I wish I could just say pronounce it however you want. Make your own pronunciation guide. But I don't want people to be mean to you because I care. So, like, I promise. I'm doing this because I'm not trying to be mean, but because I care. I promise. So that being said, if you're not going to make it pronounceable, pronunciation guide is perfectly acceptable, but please try to make it according to real pronunciation guides rather than your own. If you want to make it based on your own at first, just so you know what it is, go for it. But if you're going to publish it, you got to make it based on actual pronunciation guides. Do I sound mean? Okay, good. I was like, I don't want to sound mean. I'm just trying to tell you guys what's up.
Sound mean.
I don't think it's
I'm
physically
trying.
possible for you.
I'm trying, thanks. The other thing that I would say for names is that you can take it from other root words. So, for example, if you're like, this is a planet of water, you can go look up what is water in this random language that no one knows, and then you can just use that. It's technically cheating, but not fully cheating if you change the ending or beginning or different things like that. So if you're like, their goddess is of water in this random country is called Quiverina, and you're like, I'm gonna change it and make it Quiverique. There you go.
It kind of sounds like
I don't know.
go.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying that was something I made up. But the point is, if you take it from words other people know, then it makes it so that it feels a little bit more used to it. That's why in Harry Potter, all of the spells are just Latin for whatever the heck they mean. And including Voldemort's name. Voldemort's name in Latin is literally wish for death. That is his name in Latin. So it makes him in some ways 10 times scarier. Although it makes him far less scary when you figure out that all V's are pronounced as W's, so his name isn't Voldemort, it's Voldemort. Anyway, so
I'm calling him that
that's
now.
fun. But anyway, so that being said, taking it from other root words of other languages, especially Latin, because most languages are Latin-based, is going to help your reader feel like, this is familiar, but cool. And that tends to make it so your reader doesn't feel like, I'm drowning in all these terms. It's like, okay, I guess I kind of get it. That's why the spells work, is because people, even if they don't know Latin, know similar words. And even if they don't know that, it sounds like what it is. For example, in the fourth movie, when he goes, periculum, that literally means danger. That's why he's doing it, because she's in danger, so flare. So, as a result, it feels cool though, but at the same time, there's something deep inside your roots of language that is saying, that feels right. And that's why it works. So I would say use a root, make it pronounceable, and if you're not going to make it pronounceable, feel free to do a pronunciation guide. Just again, like we talked about earlier, it's complicated. Just know it's complicated to get published that way.
Everything's complicated.
Everything's
right?
complicated, especially the publishing world. The publishing world is scary, but not impossible. I don't want to make it seem completely scary. It's not that scary, it's just scary enough. It's like, basically, I see the publishing world like this.
We need to show her that.
Everyone views the publishing world as a big, giant alpha dragon that's gonna eat your face. It's not. It's more, it may seem like that, but it's not. I promise you, it is absolutely more like the tiny terrors from How to Train Your Dragon. They're tiny, they're terrifying, yes. Will they bite your face off if you get a 10 or 12 of them? Yes. However, they're also very easily defeatable, right? They're tiny. That's how a publishing industry is. It seems big, it seems scary, but I promise you, it is far less scary than it looks. Once you actually figure it out too. The system is complicated. Alright, last one. For naming things, this is actually one of my favorite things because it was advice given to me by Jennifer Nielsen. So, fanciness. Alright, the last one is, if you're going to name a place and you have no idea what to name it, one of the things Jennifer Nielsen says she does is she just goes, smash buttons on computer. And then after she smashes the buttons on computer and, gets A-M-I-Q-A or whatever, then she goes, okay, that's not pronounceable. And then she makes it pronounceable and goes... And she takes out a few letters until it sounds nice, maybe moves things around so it sounds a little better. Until you come up with something that's semi-pronounceable and cool. I don't know. It's just sounded the coolest out of all the options. But the point is that if you're really struggling, that is absolutely something that you can do, and actually something I've done several times, and according to Jennifer Nielsen, that's what she's done to name all of her continents, and they sound cool, so can't be too bad, right? I mean, it's pretty successful. Alright, any questions about making your own map, making your own pronunciation guide, naming towns or cultures, since we covered all that in today's lesson on making maps?
What's the difference between a town and a village?
Town versus village. Ooh, that's an excellent question. I think it's
With
primarily...
village, there's like 30 people.
I was gonna say, it's
and they all
primarily
know
population.
each other, their last name, their favorite color, and how many times they've gotten sick in the last year.
It's pretty much population.
Welcome to
So,
village.
so village is definitely a lot more like small town. Like everyone knows each other, and probably has married each other's cousin on accident. Whereas in a town, it's a lot more like 100 to 200 people at minimum. Whereas for village, the minimum's like 12, and the maximum's like 50. So it's more just a population size thing. And even then, you don't necessarily have to label village and town. They'll know whether it's a village and town based on, like I said earlier, if you go, this is about 60 people, and then you do 70 of those little things, they're gonna go, whoa, big place, not a village. So most of the time you don't have to label it as village or town because they'll be able to interpret it just based on how it looks on the map. However, if you're worried about that and they're like, this has 2 million people, I cannot possibly draw that many houses to indicate population, you can always do the good old, this is a capital, so therefore it's a star, and all stars equal a population of about 2 mil, or whatever. So, if you run into that problem, that is how I recommend you solve it. Speaking of populations, I realized I didn't cover that, and that is an important thing to cover, because sometimes there are too many people. So, any other questions about towns, cultures, and naming things? Yes, no, maybe. No, not as much? Okay, cool. If you have any questions about how to make your own map or questions about independently publishing versus traditional publishing, I've gotten a lot of questions about that recently. I'm more than happy to talk about it and discuss it with you. I'm more than happy to even discuss it about your specific book. There's a lot of things that go into especially specifics when it comes to different genres and things like that. So feel free to come talk to me. I know a lot about that, even though I don't look like I know a lot about that. I have actually worked with publishing agencies and whatnot, so I do know what I'm talking about, even though I look small. I am 22, I promise. So that being said, I hope that you all have a lovely day. Anyone who has questions on the video, please leave a comment, and thank you.